Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is James Whiting. I am the chair of the Teacher Education Interest section here at TESOL, and it's my great pleasure this morning to welcome you to our webinar entitled Educating Future English Language Teachers, Recommendations for Areas of Intractable Conflict and Beyond, with our two wonderful hosts this morning, Dr. Bridget Schvarcz and Dr. Julia Schlam Salman, both in Israel. And Bridget is, of course, the co-editor of our newsletter and here at TEIS. And so we're really pleased to have the two of them this morning for our talk. And the way it'll work is we ask that you their talk will be interactive, so there'll be questions embedded within their slide. This will go for 1 hour, so wherever your time zone is, it'll be 1 hour from now that we'll be wrapping this up, more or less. The session is being recorded, and we ask that you keep your mics muted while unless you're speaking. If you have a question that has to happen, right away, you can put it into the chat, and we'll deal with that. We'll look at the chat. And otherwise, we'll have questions going on throughout the talk. And I will now turn this over to Julia and to Bridget. The last thing I will say, just as a reminder, is that we will have another webinar, and I guess I'll do the save the date towards the end, maybe at the very last thing. So again, thank you very much, Bridget and Julia, and thank you so much for doing this and for joining it, everyone else for joining us here this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening. Take it away, Bridget, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, James, and good afternoon and good morning or good evening, everyone. I see some familiar faces, some local colleagues. So welcome to all those of you whom we do not yet know. We hope to get to know you through this discussion today. In the meantime, you can send in the chat where you're joining us from today, and enjoy the talk. Julia, over to you.
So we have a lot planned for today. The idea is really for this to be more of a conversation than a lecture. So we may not get through everything, but that's okay. So first of all, kind of to anchor us, as James said, the title of our talk is Educating for Future English Language Teachers, Recommendations for Areas of Intractable Conflict and Beyond. So this word teacher leader and language teacher leader, we throw it around quite a bit, but we wanted to get kind of a sense of what you think of when you hear this term language teacher leader. So what defines a language teacher leader? I'll go ahead and put this link into the chat. Okay. And you can add to the Mentimeter there. Okay. Please let me know if it doesn't open. There's also a URL link that you could scan with your phone. Can you see that there?
Yeah, so you can either scan it or just follow the link in the chat and tell us what defines a language teacher leader. What do you think?
Go ahead and open up the Mentimeter once again. Is it working okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me put up what you...
Those of you who joined us a little late, I'm just going to put in the chat again for you, the link to the Mentimeter, and you can still add your comments, your ideas to what makes.
A love of language, knowledgeable, creative, resilience, motivation, cultural sensitivity. I'll just refresh one more time. Beautiful. So good, opinionated, flexible, language freaks. I like that one, definitely. So I'll share with you just for a minute what some other people have said. These are actually kind of key characteristics, and neither Hattie nor the second reference are referring specifically to language teachers, but to teacher leaders. And they talk about having deep subject matter knowledge, continuing to develop their educational knowledge, which is something you all also referenced now in the Mentimeter, knowing how to monitor learning and provide feedback, believing that all students can reach success criteria or succeed, using data and evidence when making decisions, and then sharing and collaborating with other teachers, working together, learning from each other. So one of the
Thank you, Julia, for sharing all this. And now that we've heard about what makes teacher leaders and what the key characteristics of teacher leaders are, I'm inviting everybody in the audience to think about, are there any unique characteristics to English language teachers? Is there anything in addition to, do you mind, Julia, taking the previous slides, or showing the previous slides? To tell us anything in addition to what we have heard about key characteristics in general. Do you think there are any specific ones that we should think about for English language educators? Anything else we should take in consideration as teachers of English? And I'm inviting everybody to put it in the chat. Julia and I have discussed a few ideas, but of course we would like to hear your inputs. And if anybody has anything burning to say, I think we're not that many. You can even just unmute yourselves and tell us what you think, if there are any particular characteristics for English language teachers.
People will need it. Yeah, great. The responsibility of teaching a globally important language, people will need it.
Coming in the chat right now.
I'll just put up the slide again.
Just one slide back. We are extraordinarily creative in the ways we allow our students to practice and use the language. We encourage students to use the language as much as possible. In some contexts, we have to take in consideration advocacy skills. Leader teachers always invest in their professional development. I guess that is the key feature. Thanks everyone for sharing. Let's hear a little bit from you, Julia.
These are some things, as Bridget and I were preparing, that we talked about in addition. They have broad content knowledge and linguistic knowledge, right? I think this is one of the certainly features of language teachers, that we need to really know a lot about a lot of things, and also know a lot about whatever language or languages we're teaching. We need an awareness of the learner's L1 or L1s and how to acknowledge and use them as a resource in the classroom and beyond. Familiarity, this is really specific for English, of varieties of English. Knowledge of issues related to language and power, which we're going to talk about today. And recognition of the intersection between language and identity construction processes, right? Our students are acquiring a new language, and with that doesn't just come words and vocabulary and syntax, but all kinds of other things. So.
In the meantime, we had some interesting comments coming in the chat as well, that the native speakerism and the issue of native speaker English language teachers have a superiority complex, and some people agree with this. Another comment concerns the simultaneous recognition that English can serve as a cultural equalizer in some senses, and that there is a limit to its ability to do so.
Beautiful, yeah.
Very relevant for our talk today, isn't it?
Okay. So I'm just going to go on now, since we don't have that much time. we've sort of tried to anchor this in initially in what we mean by teacher leadership and teacher leaders, English language teacher leaders. And we also want to delve a little bit more into what we mean when we talk about diversity, pluralingualism, and intractable conflict. So first of all, what do we mean by an area characterized by diversity, pluralism, and intractable conflict? So I want to first locate where we're coming from. So both of us are in Israel, as James said at the beginning, and most of my work is situated in the Jerusalem context. So I wanted to emphasize that and also explain that it certainly colors the perspective that I bring to my work and my research and my teaching. And that might be different than someone who's teaching in Tel Aviv or someone who's teaching in the Gaza Strip, for sure. But in terms of what we're talking about here within these issues, we're talking about it within the context mainly of Israel, and then for me specifically within the context of Jerusalem and all of the complexities there with East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. And we're going to talk a little bit about those different populations. So here, some of you are from, we're from many different parts of the world. So just some really very basic information about Israel, the population here as of May 2022, 9.5 million people, where 21% of the population are categorized as Arabs, either Muslims, Christians, or Druze, and 74% of the population are Jewish. And within this 21%, there's quite a bit of diversity, although that's not reflected so well in this very simple pie chart. And then within the 74% of the Jewish population, we also have quite a bit of diversity within how individuals identify with respect to religious identification. So 44% identifying as secular. And then, well, you can all read, but 22% identifying as traditional, which the word doesn't translate so well, but the idea is that they have some religious affiliation, but are still kind of not so religious, moving towards sort of different to more religious, towards the ultra-Orthodox, which are the most religious at 10% of the population. So within this 74%, there's quite a bit of diversity. Why are we interested in this? Because it impacts the education trajectories within this context, where there are three main trajectories, one being official and recognized schools, the second being recognized and unofficial schools, and the third being unofficial and unrecognized schools. So those different populations then tend to track into these different kinds of schools. All of the schools are under the umbrella of the Ministry of Education, but are regulated in different ways and to different degrees and with different bodies. And then the teacher education institutions are also different. So the ultra-Orthodox schools have their own teacher education institutions. Of course, this is presented again, as we're going to talk about later when we talk about trying to dismantle binaries. This is presented in it's not a binary, but it's presented in very neat boxes, and they aren't this neat. There is crossover and integration, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But this was important kind of prerequisite information to share.
Go ahead.
And then essentially the teachers that I am preparing and working with, the future English teachers, could teach in any of these kinds of schools, although my teacher college is not specifically geared for teaching in the ultra-Orthodox trajectory or sector. Go ahead, Bridget.
I actually wanted to ask you that how this diversity will affect the teacher training and teachers who come for training in the different institutions, in particular your institution. But you already answered it with the slides.
Okay. Okay. So then I want to elaborate just a little bit on what we mean by pluralingualism. So this is some data in terms of L1, identified L1 among people in Israel who are 20 years or older. That's who were responded within this data set. So again, you can see that there are quite a lot of languages interacting. We intentionally use the word here pluralingualism because it's really not, it's not a multilingual setting. It's not that you go into different settings and you hear these languages, but these are users and speakers of these languages studying together, living together, and then within the classroom, of course, you'll have languages, different languages present among the children and students. And then the last concept that I want to elaborate on is this use, or our use, of the term intractable. Intractable conflicts, the term is based in, or is used frequently in, you can see here, but in policy studies and diplomacy and peace education. And intractable conflicts are conflicts that persist over time. They resist resolution, and they generally include some form of violence between the parties in conflict. Usually each group sees the other as an existential threat. There shouldn't be an S there. And I intentionally put that because certainly we are situated in an intractable conflict. They don't have to be, they're not inherent, but conflicts tend to move towards intractability as they escalate and as there are repeated cycles of violence, as we see in this context. So again, just to reiterate, these are some of the characteristics. And then we wanted also to include the causes in the sense that in this circumstance, in the Palestinian-Israeli intractable conflict, we have all three of these causes that Borges and Borges identify. So they're irreconcilable or perceived irreconcilable moral differences. There are high stakes distributional issues, right? Who gets water, who gets land, who gets electricity? And there are issues of power and status. In terms of characterizing intractable conflicts, we check a lot of boxes.
Julia, could you please elaborate on how this diversity, pluralingualism, and intractable conflict you described reflect on your student population?
Definitely. So just before that, so these issues then they bring up some additional considerations specifically within the Israeli-Palestinian context, which are not by any means only present in this context. But we have this religious diversity, there's high income wealth inequality, there's sociocultural diversity, and there's differences in citizen status. So these considerations are reflected in the student population that I work with in some rather specific ways. So first of all, you can see here the green. There are quite a few different kinds of speakers of L1, Hebrew speakers, L1 Hebrew speakers, L1 Arabic speakers, L1 English speakers, speakers of other languages. And then we have some issues of status. So we have Israeli-Palestinians, Palestinians who are residents of Jerusalem but are not citizens of Israel. And then we also have students who recently immigrated to Israel who were born in other countries. And so all of them are studying together in the same classes. And then in terms of the religious diversity, we have representation from all of these different religious groups. Within the religious Jews and the secular Jews, there may be some of those other categorizations that we talked about before in terms of being traditional or being traditional and religious. And then this last category, students who are the first in their family to access higher education, alongside academics who are retraining to be English teachers, which is a not insignificant percentage of the students who study in our in my institution and in other institutions in the country. So really, it's a very rich, diverse context. So go ahead, Bridget.
Yeah. So as Julia has described up till now, her student population in Jerusalem, as we have seen, is highly diverse, whether it's given the linguistic situation or the religious situation or citizenship status. I know some of you are here from Israel, but I know some of you are not. And how does all this diversity differ from the context in which you are teaching, or whether it resonates with it? And if so, how do you see any similarities, any differences you see in the context in which you're working and or preparing future English language teachers? And some answers already coming in the chat. You're welcome to type them. So for example, Elizabeth says to us that if she's teaching a mixed group, she doesn't dare encourage lively debate or discussion on a variety of interesting topics because they might be controversial for some. Any other ideas? You can also feel free to
things that resonate with you within your context.
Within your context, it may be a different kind of diversity where you are teaching.
I'll put the question.
I see some people are focusing, so they might be focusing on the keyboard, but if anybody wishes to just unmute themselves, we're not that many, you may. James, maybe you have some ideas to share about diversity in your context of preparing future English teachers.
Yeah, I just was thinking, I was typing, but in my own context, it's probably the polar opposite to what Julie has just described. I mean, it's really quite undiverse in terms of the teacher candidates in rural New England. What's interesting is that they come in contact with students who are quite diverse, and so there's a kind of the diversity comes with the students, and the teachers are really quite not diverse in terms of their particular characteristics, and most of whom are monolingual with very limited experience with English language learners in my own context. So it's very different and very interesting to hear the kind, and there certainly is no religious overtones whatsoever. I mean, there might be, but it's not explicitly part of the conversation. Some of the students that they might be encountering are from Muslim countries, but that's about it. So I'm interested to hear how it's so different from what you're describing.
Okay. We also have here another polar opposite. Richard is fortunate to teach students that have a common L1 in Japan, I assume, which is Japanese. Anybody in a highly diverse context or not so highly diverse context and would like to share something here? Raviv teaches in an MA program in nonprofit management at the Hebrew U in English, and his students include Jews, Arabs, and many others from all over the world. They do not have the luxury of shying away from social political issues that are considered controversial, but the fact that the discussion is in English affords a certain civility and mutual respect that might not be the case if the class were conducted in Hebrew or in Arabic. And I think this links back to his previous comment where Raviv called English as a cultural equalizer. So here is really an example of it in action in his mixed class. Thank you, Raviv. Thank you, James. And thank you, Richard, for sharing. I'm going to hand it over back to Julia.
Okay. So James, I'm going to try to be mindful of the time. But we're going to now delve into, so the impetus of this talk was a short piece that appeared in the teacher educator interest section of the TESOL Educator interest section newsletter that focused on means for fostering future English language teacher leaders. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, or the rest of the time today, talking about sort of 3 recommendations, means, ideas that I have been thinking about and working with. So the first one is dismantling binary thinking. And this process of dismantling binary thinking begins by helping future teachers to recognize the pervasiveness of binary thinking. I think we really do it all the time. I'm sure I've done it in this talk. We humans like binaries. So they can be general, strong, weak, motivated, unmotivated. They can be specific with respect to language knowledge, good at English, bad at English, and they can be specific within the local context, within this local context where I'm located, Jewish, Arab, religious, secular. And so an important piece of dismantling binary thinking is first to talk about how they're perceived, their perception, and they're externally constructed. And so this perceived binary sameness doesn't equal sameness. And once we begin to acknowledge that that's constructed and not necessarily, and not absolute, you can start to better engage with heterogeneity and difference encountered in the classroom. And also to enable students to express multiple salient identities and multiple ways in which they perhaps construct themselves, even if the external context would construct them otherwise. And I think that that's something that's very powerful within the English language classroom, where the learner has an opportunity to take on additional identifications and also to express additional identities. So these are 2 kind of, well, on the left is an example, which may be familiar to some of you because it's really been formed in a lot of different variations in a lot of different settings, and it's taken from some materials developed by the United States Institute of Peace for conflict resolution in the EFL classroom. But the idea here is just to get the students to begin thinking about the groups that they belong to, and what might be their primary group, and where these groups overlap. And I find that this is also pretty interesting for students because they come in with their assumptions about how you might identify yourself, and then they see, oh, the student actually put these other things that I didn't know about them, or I wouldn't have assumed or seen that. And then particularly with your primary group or your primary identification, right? So externally, you might first and foremost be identified as an ultra-Orthodox person or a Haredi person, but the person themselves may choose to put a different salient identity forward first as the most salient identity. So some of the local binaries that we work on or need to be unpacking are this religious secular binary, the Arab Jewish binary. Within the Jewish population, there's a very strong binary between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews, so Jews from Middle East and North Africa, and Ashkenazi, which are Jews from Europe and Eastern Europe. And then these local binaries, of course, also have implications on some other ostensibly more general binaries, strong, weak, educated, uneducated. And if we go back to what we discussed at the beginning, this idea or the importance of lead teachers stating and expressing strongly that all students can reach success and can reach whatever we've defined as our learning outcomes or our success criteria. Go ahead.
And I'm handing the microphone over to our audience. What are some of the local binaries in your context and how you may begin dismantling them? So again, if anybody wishes to type, you can. If you wish to show us your voice, you're welcome to unmute yourselves and share some of the binaries you have encountered in your teaching context. And what could you do about them? How you could. We have at-risk versus normative youth coming in the chat.
Bridget, should I stop sharing? Or?
Yes, you may. Yeah, thank you for a moment. So if anybody wishes to share some binaries they have encountered.
Hello.
Hi, Mahdi. Yes, go ahead.
How are you? Well, I'm really appreciative to be among you all teachers. Yeah, there are actually different binaries and you may like to actually focus on the binaries in your classroom. I mean, some types of binaries could be shaped in your classroom whenever, for example, you are teaching co-ed classes. I mean, classes that are girls and boys are mixed together. In some cases, the binary that is shaped in co-ed classes is different with the binaries that is shaped in single gender classes. And also you can investigate binaries when you have classes that students are from different cultures. They may come from different backgrounds and at times they may clash together. For example, different nations or nationalities in a classroom can shape a binary. And when you are describing a point and when you are mentioning a point, some students from a background, they may oppose to what you are saying or the example that you are talking about. And some of them may like your example and they say nothing. They are eager to hear more from you. So I think these binaries could be investigated more and in details.
Thank you, Mahdi, for sharing. I
You're welcome.
If I'm inferred correctly, thank you so much. I think you mentioned 3 different kinds. One of them is a gender-based binary.
Yes.
The other one is background of students, whether it's nationalities or any other kind of family or socio-ethnic or cultural background. And even a binary is that you mentioned is whether the students like what you have said or not. Thank you. We have another.
Actually, can I add a point?
Go ahead.
Can I add a point? Okay, sorry. I want, if people are interested in finding out the binaries in the classroom, they can. I want to refer them to a doctoral thesis, which is written by one of graduate students of Stanford University. His name is Masoud Jaspi, and he amazingly investigated students in 3 types, binary, ternary, and free-form classes. And he posted a brief description of his doctoral thesis on YouTube. They can search his name and they will find both his doctoral thesis and you. Yeah.
That sounds very interesting. Do you mind actually typing his name and the name of the thesis in the chat itself so that we can all look for him and for the thesis itself? That would be very, very useful if you could just add the details of the author and the thesis. And some people already reacted that, yes, they see the binary issues in co-ed classes that you have shared. And we have another issue coming from Heidi, who had East Jerusalem Arab students who are Israeli citizens and who are not. And this can be a cause for conflict. Julia also briefly mentioned the citizenship status differences, and Heidi here had an example, a case of that. Heidi, would you like to briefly relate to it, very briefly? You are on mute.
Relate to it very briefly, but the truth was I couldn't handle it. I couldn't deal with it. We just changed the topic because I didn't know where to take it. I mean, it's such a sensitive issue in an East Jerusalem Arab class. The very few students who are Israeli students, as opposed to most of them, which are clearly not. And I can't go there. I just can't. I just like change the subject, or like said, we're not talking about that now, and just change the subject. I couldn't handle it.
Right. Thank you, Heidi, for your personal perspective on it. But that is definitely something that very much relates to this talk. What do we do with these kinds of underlying differences and difficulties, and whether we should bring it to classroom discourse or just not to deal with it and carry on with our material.
I actually think that segues nicely into the next topic
Exactly.
that we were the next issue. So I'm going to put it up. So the second kind of recommendation or means for is seeing multiple understandings, which is certainly connected to, or an extension of, dismantling binary thinking. So a piece of this is really first to encourage students to delay the urge to react and to take a deep breath and say, okay, how is the person I'm speaking with, the interlocutor here, but the speaker or the student or the teacher or the principal, how have they come to the belief or behavior that they're exhibiting? What's going on? And I guess sort of a prerequisite belief of mine is to try to assume that I don't know. You know, every person has a story. Every person has various struggles, issues, matters going on, and very few are malintended from the beginning. And maybe I am willing to be naive and named as naive, but to look where the intention is and to assume that it's not a bad intention. And that's very difficult given the world we are in terms of instant everything, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But I think the role that we can play as language teachers, and here I would say even more generally as language teachers and not just English teachers, where we can shed light on different understandings, as well as the nuanced layers present in multilingual contexts. So many times when there are different cultures interacting, there's a need to translate what's going on, and to explain what are the underlying meanings. What is this? What does this display represent? What is being conveyed here that for the dominant culture present might be very obvious, but for minority languages and minority cultures might not be clear. And I think that this carries over even in monolingual settings, where it's important to translate the dominant or expected discourse. And that's a very important step if we actually want to dismantle hegemony. So we talk about wanting to speak in correct or politically correct ways, but politically correctness is also something that's constructed. And so it's important to explain and to make clear whatever the expected discourse is, so that users have the opportunity to practice and use. We empower learners when we create safe spaces to ask and question, to be curious about meanings and to acknowledge that there are multiple ways to see, understand, and describe situations. So these are two kind of catalysts that I like to use for exemplifying different perspectives. And the first may be familiar to you. And if you look at it right, there can be 3 or 4 bars, depending on how you look at it. Excuse me. And then on the other side is this little comic. Everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. Nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. Without getting into anything beyond sort of very much what is present in front of us, I think you can see how this could be a catalyst for thinking about what perspective one is bringing to what they see and how it's described. Bridget, we wanted to open it up again for questions, but
we're going to open it up for comments, discussions, reflections on your contexts. So how, if at all, is the notion of fostering multiple understandings relevant to your context? Can you think of a situation where you needed to foster multiple understandings? What did you do? How did the others respond? Anybody wishes to share, feel free to unmute yourselves or just type in the chat. I see very, very few cameras on. Michelle, maybe you have any examples, any situations you encountered, you think you may encounter in your teaching context? Would you like to share?
Hi. Actually, the work that I was doing, but I've since retired, but I'm working on my doctorate, finishing up that work. Been working for a long time using literature, teaching introduction to literature, but at the same time using literature as a way for students to respond to literature. And I'm not talking about politically inflamed literature. I'm talking about Robert Frost and Catherine Mansfield, but using different kinds of literary pieces so that students in the class, which is a completely multicultural class, on the Golan Heights with all the segments of the Israeli population, using literature as a way for students to share their experiences and seeing cross-culturally that some people from different cultures have similar experiences or similar stories to tell. Others have very different ones from the same culture also. So that breaks down those binaries. In fact, it reflects the very different aspects that people have. It's a field that I'm greatly interested in when I'm doing my doctorate, and using literature as a way actually to break down or open up conversations.
nice, very nice.
Anybody else wishes to share any thoughts on multiple understandings, and what are the different multiple understandings that you could foster?
And I will just add here, Bridget, so at the end, I will share the link to the article from which this was addressed. And in it, I give an example of a situation in my college where Ramadan coincided with the Memorial Day for fallen soldiers in Israel. And there was a misunderstanding of a memorial site that had been set up there. And part of what was going on there was that there was a mistranslation of what that represented. And that's really a place where those of us who are aware of what was the first in the beginning comment, obsessed with languages, or seeing languages language all the time as representation of culture, that there was a deep need to translate that cultural context, and it wasn't translated, and that led to conflict. Okay, so I'll go on, Bridget.
You can carry on, yes.
Okay. So then, thing that I want to talk about, which I am guessing is familiar to many of you who are working as teachers and teacher educators, is this concept of engaging in reflective practice. And the previously 2 points, dismantling binary thinking and seeing multiple perspectives, really can't be advanced without regular reflection and reflective practice. And I am using this term intentionally, although it doesn't only refer to practice in the sense of the practice that I do in the class while I'm teaching, but really a more holistic conception of it, where I'm not just a language teacher, but I'm thinking about my interaction and my behavior almost all the time, I guess, within whatever educational setting I'm situated. So some important questions in this realm include, how did the learner get to that answer or action? This is particularly important when we're talking about language learning. What is my role as a language educator in mediating the situation at hand? What can I do specifically and uniquely as an English language teacher? So in an age of instant everything, delaying response and first reflecting is a cornerstone of language teacher leadership. This attribute requires thoughtful attention to beliefs and feelings, subsequent attention to thinking, and finally to the ways in which thinking then informs the discourse we use, as well, of course, our behaviors and our actions. And then just pulling out some points that I think are particularly relevant in an area of intractable conflict. So reflective practice can foster an awareness of biases, an uncovering of assumptions about race, culture, and ethnicity, a recognition of complexities present within the specific context. Each time I think I understand, I don't. I reflect some more. And then reflection must extend beyond language pedagogical practices, right? It's not just how I'm teaching vocabulary and grammar. It's what content am I teaching, how am I teaching it, and what are my beliefs and values that are being carried into that as well, both about how languages should be taught and learned and how in general learning should happen and take place. And then this is just a quote from the piece. The practice of reflection serves future teachers when they encounter a disrespectful student, a difficult parent, or conflicts that arise in the classroom, be they general issues or those specific to the local socio-political circumstances.
And again, over to you, ladies and gentlemen. What opportunities for reflection have arisen in your context of practice? Feel free to unmute yourselves and share.
And I think if this question doesn't resonate, we can also just open it up now for questions. For
general comments, questions, discussion.
We'll stop sharing.
Yeah. Any thoughts, ideas, anything you would like to share, ask, discuss? Any key takeaways, ideas you're leaving with from today? Michelle, I see you unmuted yourself.
I was trying to think where to fit into this, and I think is, at least for myself and probably most of us as teachers, we're always reflective in terms of what we're doing, especially when we are particularly interested in these kinds of issues, and we have these classrooms with a whole wide range of the population. I think also the fact as a teacher educator, create kind of class that in which we're fairly close to our students also, and listening in and just being very sensitive to each other. I think, you talk about a situation where you're talking about someone like Julia that's sitting in Jerusalem, or Heidi is talking about sitting in East Jerusalem, and I'm sitting in the Golan Heights. Anyone that's familiar with Israel knows the dynamics are different in these kinds of places, and maybe the relationships can be different. But I found that I'm always just being aware of trying to see where students from different groups that are not from the Jewish culture may not be catching something. I don't really find it. The class is so open and people share a lot. Again, I said it's because it's literature. It's a different kind of thing than teaching, let's say, language. I think, and I don't know if we really talked about this in your talk here, is that and talking about people that are coming from such different languages. You talked about them initially, but so much is going on when we've got these multi layers of Arabic speakers that are actually in like a third language when they come to meet us. So that's always something that I'm thinking about and reflecting about, is how much are they really getting? Tricky part of also teaching literature is you're talking about like another level. It's not, let's say, learning specific vocabulary, a simple level of the colors, numbers, whatever, talking about the highest level of the language, but also then the richest in which people can get and share kind of deeper things. And as I said initially, we have a close relationship, and I think that students then have opportunities to get to know each other across cultures, which I think is unique. I don't know if I've added anything, but that's sort of where it's taking me.
Right. Thank you. Beth, you have an interesting comment about US teaching context. Would you like to elaborate on it? You can just unmute yourself. I'm going to read it out in the meantime. So Beth thinks that in many US, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry,
You can tell us what you think.
I'm in Boulder, Colorado, so I'm not even dressed. So that's why I don't want to take off my camera. The thing is, I think the problem first of all, this is very interesting. I didn't know some of this research that you're referencing, and but I think the problem many of us have is many teachers in the United States who are teaching English as well as other subjects have no knowledge of the nuances or even any of the facts of the conflicts. And so they're teaching students that have come who are refugee students or students who've migrated from other countries, and they have really no knowledge of where they're coming from. And so I think it's very hard. I mean, this idea of having a discussion, that's why I think literature, where you have voices from let's say, writers who are from those communities, I think is really important, because it helps the teacher then can present an authentic voice when he or she doesn't have that knowledge. That's all I want to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, and we appreciate you waking up so early for this talk. Anybody else would like to share anything, any ideas, thoughts?
We're here, I'll share this slide. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a
This is
question.
time for the questions and comments. Go ahead.
Go ahead, James.
I just wanted to clarify or understand something. We're talking about training English language teachers in these contexts in Israel. And so they're going to be working as English as a foreign language in various classrooms. How diverse are the classrooms that they're going to be teaching in? What are the situations that most of these teachers end up in? Or is the diversity that we're talking about solely teacher training programs, and do people go into different kinds of situations? For example, the Arab Israelis that you described, are they going to be teaching who are they teaching, for example? Are they teaching other Arab Israelis? Are they going to be teaching as non-Arab Israelis, etc.? So I'm just curious, as someone who's outside of your context, I don't really know what the next step is for these trained teachers.
So part of the reason I included that this slide, and maybe I'll just jump back to it, is that they can end up, I should have done this differently, sorry. They can teach, so teacher education college, my teacher education college is situated in Jerusalem. It's pretty diverse. My colleague here, I don't know if she's still there, she teaches in the South. I think her institution is pretty diverse, but then once they begin working in a school, you wouldn't have a lot of diversity within these trajectories. So if you're in a state school, you probably won't have a lot of religious Jewish students in your school. Within the religious state schools, it's a little bit less, there's a little bit more diversity in terms of levels of religious practice. And then in terms of an L1 Arabic speaker, for example, going in to teach in an L1 Hebrew speaking school, you do have that, and you have it more and more, in part because there's a need for English teachers. There's a need for teachers of many subjects, including English. You do also have, so you might have a religious teacher teaching in a non-religious school, or the other way around, although again, there are some complexities around that in terms of whether or not and who the school administration wants represented in this, the teacher body, the teachers who are teaching in their schools. So yeah, I think, does that answer your question?
It does. And so it sounds like the situations are not particularly diverse. The student bodies are relatively homogeneous. Is that right?
They're relatively homogeneous. And I think that's part of also where the issue of pluralingualism is very important, because there's a need to raise the awareness that yes, your students, your pupils may be coming with different L1s, or maybe using another language at home, and how does that impact, of course, first language learning, and how does that impact English learning?
Right. Oh, that's very interesting.
And then just the last thing I wanted to say is that yes, you might have some socioeconomic diversity within those different schools.
One of the things I wanted that I'll add to this, Joy, is the fact that, so what ends up happening, James, is the teacher education colleges tend to be diverse. As by and large, and I think you probably agree with me, Julia and Bridget, we go into classrooms that are not diverse. And that's exactly why I particularly see the teacher education is an amazing opportunity for us in order to raise a kind of awareness. This is one of the few places where all these cultures cross.
So interesting. Yeah, that's really quite interesting. It's actually, what's even more interesting is that in my situation is exactly the opposite. So, the teacher education situations are extremely homogeneous. They're very, monolingual, fill in the blank Americans. And then they're in classrooms that are remarkably diverse. So interesting. There's got to be some research there. Isn't that interesting? Some sort of cross-cultural research there. Interesting. How you approach, doing the same thing, training English language teachers in very different kinds of situations.
And I think also the expanding on the perception of binary or singleness, that there's a perception of sameness, that if we dig a little deeper, there actually is more heterogeneity than
yeah, of course.
Yeah. Sorry, can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Okay. I've figured out, you mentioned does binary class, do binary classes help students to raise their awareness? Could it be possible?
Sorry, it cut out a little at the end. I didn't hear the last part. Bridget, did you hear it?
Whether binary classes, can you please repeat the question, Mahdi?
Do binary classes help students raise more awareness?
So I think my use here of the terms of dismantling binaries is not that the classes are intentionally binary, but that that we bring to classroom spaces a tendency to think in binary terms, whether it's educated or uneducated, or motivated or unmotivated, or good at English and bad at English. So it's not that the classroom itself is a binary, but rather that we are constructing or putting binaries onto it.
Our time is nearly up. So Julia, if you would like to sum up and show I've shared the link to your article in the chat, but if you would like to share contact info.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I really should do this differently.
And I would like to thank everybody for coming and spending this morning, afternoon with us learning about intractable conflicts and recommendations for teaching English as a foreign language, second language in these areas, and how we should educate future English language teachers. So Julia has an article about it in the Future Educator Intersection newsletter. I've shared the link with everybody in the chat. You are welcome to check it out and read and look at what you've heard in a written format. James, over to you. Maybe you would like to
Yeah.
the next webinar.
I'll just echo what Bridget just said and thank everyone very much for turning out this morning and earlier if you're in the West Coast of the United States, for example, or evening or afternoon. Excuse me. Thank you so much for all of your time and joining us. It was really wonderful, and especially big thanks to Bridget and Julia for a really terrific and interesting conversation. I urge everyone to take a look at Julia's article and also the other articles that Bridget and Conduct are editing in our newsletter. A really wonderful newsletter that comes out twice or three times a year. Real powerhouse newsletter that we produce, and so I thank you so much.
And we just had an issue 3 weeks ago, so we have a brand new summer issue.
Yeah, so be in touch, and this is a wonderful publishing possibility for folks out there. Be in touch with Bridget and Conduct about that. So thank you again all for joining us this morning. I want to just give a little plug for our next talk, which is going to be 6 weeks from now. So for me, it'll be the middle of the semester. This is the very first week of the semester, so it's amazing. It's 6 weeks ahead. We will have Duhad Rashid from Rutgers University in New Jersey, who will be speaking about language teaching and social justice. So there'll be an announcement about that, but thank you for keeping that in mind for about 6 weeks from now. And again, a big thanks to Julia Schvarcz and, Bridget Schvarcz and Julia Schlam Salman, sorry, and just getting everything wrong.
Very much.
Thank you very much for both of your big effort, and wonderful seeing you all this morning. Thank you.